The morning sun had barely crested over Denver International Airport when Flight 739 prepared for departure. Passengers shuffled down the jet bridge, clutching coffee cups, boarding passes and carry-ons, chatting casually, unaware of the chaos that would soon grip their lives. Among them was Emma Collins, a petite 11-year-old with untamed brown curls, her backpack nearly as big as her frame. She had always loved airplanes, the roar of engines, the mechanical heartbeat of wings slicing through clouds, but she had never imagined she'd need to know how to fly one herself. Today, that knowledge was about to be tested in ways no child or adult could ever predict. Captain Marcus Hayes, a veteran of 21 years, barked commands with practiced authority. His co-pilot, Jonah Lynn, nodded in rhythm, tapping the flight deck screens with precision. The cabin crew went through their final safety checks while Emma's mother, Claire, whispered comforting words into her daughter's ear, unaware that the worst part of the journey hadn't even begun. The plane, a gleaming Boeing 737, rumbled down the runway, engines screaming in harmony with the tension building in the cabin. Flight attendants locked eyes briefly, sharing the kind of unspoken trust honed through thousands of flights. The passengers leaned back, assuming the standard hum of takeoff would carry them safely to Chicago. For most, it was a routine day. For Emma, it was the calm before a storm she would never forget. 3 minutes into the ascent, a sharp jolt ripped through the aircraft. Drinks spilled, passengers gasped, and the cabin lights flickered. Jonah's hand flew to the control panel. "Engine 2 fluctuating pressure. We've got a problem," Captain Hayes barked, muscles tensing as he fought to stabilize the plane. The plane shuddered violently, throwing Emma and Claire forward. Emma's mother grabbed her tightly, her knuckles white, heart hammering like a drum in her chest. A warning siren pierced the cockpit, a shrill, unforgiving wail. Captain Hayes swore under his breath, his eyes scanning the digital dashboard, noting the catastrophic loss of altitude. The cabin tilted unnaturally, and the screams of terrified passengers filled the air. Oxygen masks dropped automatically, and chaos erupted as the plane dipped sharply, the horizon outside twisting into a dizzying blur. The ground seemed closer than it should have been. Emma's heart raced. The fear was unlike anything she had ever felt, yet somehow, amidst the panic, clarity struck. She had spent years on flight simulators, memorizing cockpit layouts, engine sequences, and emergency maneuvers. It had been a hobby at first, her own private world where buttons and levers obeyed her command. Now, that hobby was the only chance anyone had of surviving the disaster unfolding around them. Claire glanced at her daughter, panic transforming into disbelief. "Emma, stay put." She began, but words failed her. Emma's small hands gripped the armrests, eyes locked on the cockpit door, mind racing faster than the engines themselves. The flight attendants struggled to calm passengers, but screams, prayers, and sobs collided, forming a chaotic symphony that mirrored the plane's turbulent heartbeat. Inside the cockpit, Captain Hayes was wrestling with controls that seemed to defy physics, the plane veering dangerously toward a downward spiral. Jonah's fingers flew across the touchscreen, trying to stabilize the failing systems, but the aircraft groaned under mechanical strain. Metal flexed, hydraulics hissed, and a cloud of smoke wafted briefly from the console. He looked up, eyes wide, and froze as the plane lurched again. It was then that the cockpit door creaked, a tiny hand slipping through the opening. Emma's gaze was steady, unnervingly calm for someone her age. "Captain Hayes," she said, voice trembling yet firm. "I know what to do, please let me help." The words hung in the air like a fragile lifeline. Hayes froze. His training screamed at him to resist, to guard the controls, but something in Emma's eyes, a mix of terror and determination, made his own fear pulse more urgently. In the cabin, passengers noticed the plane's jerking movements growing sharper. The ground outside seemed to tilt, clouds spinning unnaturally fast. A mother clutched her child, whispering frantic prayers, while a businessman in seat stared blankly at his coffee cup, which had spilled across his lap. Somewhere near the rear, a young couple held hands tightly, silently bracing for impact. The seconds stretched into eternity. Captain Hayes swallowed hard, sweat dripping down his brow. You're serious?" he asked, voice barely audible over the howling wind and alarms. Emma nodded, eyes burning with focus. "I've practiced this. I can help stabilize the plane. I just need access to the controls." Hayes's hands hovered over the yoke. Jonah's eyes darted between the failing instruments and the girl in front of them. The cockpit smelled of ozone and fear, a metallic tang that set everyone on edge. Every second counted, every decision a matter of life and death. The plane's descent accelerated, altitude numbers flashing red like a countdown to doom. Claire gripped the back of a seat, tears streaming down her face. "Please," she whispered, voice cracking. Emma turned to her mother, offering a fleeting, determined smile, then back to the cockpit. Her fingers trembled slightly but held steady as she prepared to step into a nightmare she had never imagined, ready to face the impossible. Then, as the plane lurched once more, plunging toward a jagged ridge of clouds, Emma reached for the controls, tiny hands against massive responsibility. Around her, the passengers braced for impact, unaware that the fate of 275 lives would soon hinge on the courage of an 11-year-old girl. And just as the plane seemed moments from giving up its fight against gravity, a calm, resolute voice cut through the chaos. "Hold on. I've got this." The cockpit fell silent for a heartbeat, an eerie pause before what came next would shock everyone on board. Emma's fingers hovered over the controls, her small hands feeling the weight of a machine designed for seasoned pilots. The cockpit was a storm of blinking lights, flashing red warnings, and the low groan of failing hydraulics. Captain Hayes watched her intently, disbelief and fear etched across his face. "You've never flown a real plane, kid," he said, his voice tight. Emma swallowed hard, but her eyes didn't waver. "I haven't, but I know enough. Please, you have to trust me." Jonah's brow furrowed. "Marcus, this is insane. We can't." Hayes held up a hand, silencing him. For a split second, the cabin seemed to go quiet, the chaos outside muffled by the cockpit walls. Every passenger's life now rested on an impossible gamble. Emma's mind raced through every simulator session she had endured, the sudden stalls, engine failures, emergency descents, and turbulence drills. She visualized the plane as a giant bird, one that needed gentle coaxing, not brute force. She reached out and pressed a sequence of buttons, flipping switches with surprising precision. The plane shuddered, groaning as if resisting her touch, but then minutely it steadied. Hayes's jaw dropped. Okay, you might actually know what you're doing," he muttered, still gripping his own yoke. Jonah's hands hovered, unsure whether to intervene or watch history unfold. Emma's gaze flicked to the altimeter, which read dangerously low. They had descended almost 5,000 feet in under 2 minutes, and the terrain below was jagged, a patchwork of mountains and forests that could easily tear the fuselage apart. In the cabin, the tension was palpable. Passengers clutched seats, prayed aloud, and whispered farewells. A mother in row 22 gripped her husband's hand so tightly her knuckles turned white, murmuring, "We're going to make it. We're going to make it." A young man in the exit row had stopped crying, his face frozen in a mixture of fear and disbelief, staring at the overhead compartments as if willing them to hold the plane together. Suddenly, the plane lurched violently to the left, throwing Emma slightly forward. She gritted her teeth, forcing herself to remain steady. Hayes called out, "Rudder! Use the rudder, Emma." She pivoted her small hands, twisting the controls as she remembered every detail from her simulator hours. Slowly, agonizingly, the plane's wings leveled. A collective groan of relief could almost be heard through the cockpit glass. Outside, the horizon twisted unnaturally as clouds churned, lightning illuminating the straining fuselage. The engines wheezed, smoke curling from the failing right engine. Jonah muttered under his breath, "We're losing power too fast." Emma's stomach sank. She knew she couldn't just stabilize, she had to land and fast. But no one had the runway coordinates or clearance. The autopilot had failed entirely, leaving only manual controls. Marcus, Emma said, voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins, we need to descend slowly. Keep the nose up slightly and we can glide toward that clearing I see on the instruments. Hayes followed her instructions, still shaking with disbelief. Jonah monitored the instruments frantically, calculating fuel, engine stress, and glide ratios. Every second counted. Every wrong move could spell death for everyone on board. Back in the cabin, a child cried silently, clutching a stuffed animal. Claire held Emma's backpack to her chest, unaware that the girl she thought was in danger was now the pilot of their lives. The other passengers were a mix of frozen terror and quiet hope. Flight attendants struggled to maintain composure, trying to calm the panicked passengers while their own faces betrayed fear. Emma's hands moved with surprising confidence, flipping switches, adjusting flaps, and monitoring the failing systems. The plane quivered violently under her touch, threatening to roll over. Hayes leaned close, his voice a whisper. I can't believe this is working, but don't get cocky. Emma nodded, lips pressed together. She knew any small miscalculation could end everything. Suddenly the cabin lurched again, violently this time. A sharp alarm blared, a warning that the plane's remaining engine was overheating. Jonah's eyes widened. We've got less than 10 minutes before complete failure. Panic surged in Hayes's chest. Emma's heart pounded in her ears, but she forced herself to stay calm, visualizing the plane's weight, the airflow, and the glide path to safety. Claire's voice trembled as she whispered, Emma, just come back to me. Emma stole a glance at her mother, then at the array of flashing lights. She took a deep breath and whispered to herself, I can do this. I have to do this. She nudged the yoke forward slightly, feeling the plane respond inch by agonizing inch. The clouds thickened, a rolling gray wall that obscured any sense of direction. Lightning flashed dangerously close, illuminating the frightened faces of passengers. The aircraft groaned under strain, metal protesting with sharp cracks. Hayes leaned over Emma, watching her work. He had never seen anyone, let alone an 11-year-old, manipulate a plane under such conditions with such clarity. Emma, you might just save us all, he said, his voice caught between awe and fear. Emma gave a small nod, eyes locked on the instrument panel. Outside, the earth seemed to rise to meet them, the clearing on the map shrinking by the second. The plane continued its precarious descent, as though the thin line between life and death had never been more tangible. Then, just as hope began to flicker like a candle in the storm, the right engine let out a deafening screech and failed completely. The plane shuddered violently, throwing Emma against her seat harness. Hayes and Jonah shouted in unison, but Emma's focus sharpened. She gritted her teeth and whispered, almost there, almost there. The cockpit lights flickered as the plane shuddered again. Smoke curled through the vents, alarms screaming. The 275 souls aboard braced for impact, some closing eyes, some gripping loved ones, none knowing that salvation rested in the hands of a child. Emma's fingers tightened on the yoke, her mind racing faster than the failing engines. And then, in a heartbeat that felt like an eternity, the plane entered a glide path toward the clearing, tilting dangerously, but miraculously holding together. The cockpit fell silent for a moment, the tension so thick it could be cut with a knife. Every soul on board felt it, the fragile thread between disaster and survival. But as the plane cut through the clouds, a new, unexpected danger loomed just ahead. The clearing ahead was smaller than Emma had calculated. Trees lined its edges like jagged teeth, and jagged rocks jutted up unpredictably from the ground. The plane, already groaning under the strain of one failing engine, shuddered as it approached, tilting perilously to the right. Emma's small hands were white-knuckled on the yoke, sweat dripping down her temple, but her eyes were locked on that patch of earth, a fragile promise of survival in a world that seemed determined to deny it. Marcus, Jonah, we need to line up perfectly, she said, her voice unnervingly steady. Hayes swallowed hard, his face pale. I can't believe this is happening, but okay, do it. Jonah's hands hovered over the instrument panel, ready to assist if the girl's calculations faltered. He'd long since realized that their fate rested entirely on Emma. The plane dipped lower, turbulence throwing it violently side to side. Oxygen masks bounced as passengers screamed or prayed, some holding children close while others stared blankly at the windows. Claire gripped the armrest, her knuckles bleeding from pressure, eyes locked on Emma's reflection in the cockpit glass. "Please, don't let it end like this," she whispered, tears streaming down her cheeks. Emma heard her mother, felt the fear and hope entwined in every word, and drew strength from it. The first obstacle appeared, an unexpected ridge that had not shown up clearly on the outdated terrain maps. Emma's mind raced. "Bank slightly left, flare just before the ridge, throttle minimal," she directed Hayes and Jonah with precision. The plane groaned under the stress, wings flexing dangerously. Hayes's voice cracked. "We might not make it, kid." Emma's jaw tightened. "We will, just trust me." Lightning streaked across the sky, illuminating the forest below. Passengers screamed, some clutching the seats in front of them, others silently mouthing prayers. A father in row 11 held his daughter close, whispering, "We're going to be okay, we're going to be okay," but even he couldn't fully believe it. The plane's descent was far too fast, far too precarious. Every inch closer to the ground felt like a gamble with death itself. Emma guided the plane with careful micro-adjustments, feeling the tension of metal, engines, and gravity pressing down on her. The flaps shuddered violently as they extended, trying to slow the descent. Hayes' hands hovered, ready to correct any misstep, while Jonah calculated the glide ratio, sweat beading on his forehead. The cockpit was a crucible of fear, hope, and adrenaline, a place where life and death were separated by fractions of a second. Below, the clearing loomed ever closer. Trees rushed upward like spiked towers, their shadows reaching into the plane like black fingers. Emma's mind raced through the simulator drills she'd practiced countless times, visualizing every second of descent, every touch of the yoke, every subtle movement that could save or doom them. The right engine's death had shifted the balance. She had to compensate or risk flipping the plane entirely. Suddenly, a gust of wind hit from the left, tilting the plane dangerously. Hayes shouted, "Rudder, rudder!" Emma twisted the control carefully, but the plane dipped, scraping treetops. Branches snapped against the fuselage, rattling the windows, and screams erupted in the cabin. Panic surged in Claire's chest as she covered Emma with her arms, feeling the terrifying closeness of death. Emma's teeth clenched, but she pushed forward, eyes focused, heart hammering. The clearing shrank to a patch of brown and green, uneven, littered with rocks and fallen trees. Emma's mind raced for a solution. "We're going to have to land hot, fast, no time for gentle glide," she said, voice steady despite adrenaline surging through every vein. Hayes nodded, a silent agreement passing between them. Jonah adjusted the flaps, sweat dripping from his temples. Time slowed. Emma's hands moved with precision, adjusting the angle of descent, compensating for turbulence, flares, and engine failure. Outside, the world blurred, a mix of storm clouds, jagged trees, and the patchwork ground below. Inside, passengers screamed and prayed, some frozen, some shaking, all aware of the razor-thin line between life and catastrophe. The plane shuddered violently, hitting the edge of the clearing. Branches scraped along the fuselage, ripping panels from the sides. Emma's stomach lurched, but she held steady, guiding the plane down with micro-adjustments, relying on instinct honed from simulators and pure determination. Hayes muttered under his breath, disbelief echoing in the cockpit. "This girl, she's actually doing it." The first set of rocks loomed ahead, huge boulders that could obliterate the plane instantly. Emma's eyes widened, calculating angles, speed, and momentum. She shifted the yoke, letting the plane rise slightly, then drop in a calculated maneuver to avoid collision. The fuselage rattled, the landing gear barely clearing jagged stones, and a collective gasp rose from the cabin. Claire's face was pale, tears streaking dirt and sweat. "Emma, oh my God!" Her voice was caught between fear and awe. Emma stole a glance at her mother, drawing strength from her gaze. "Almost there, just a little more," she whispered to herself, though the words were meant for everyone aboard. The plane's nose tipped downward, engines whining, flaps straining. Passengers braced for impact, gripping seats, crying or silently surrendering to fate. Outside, the clearing ended abruptly in dense forest and rocks, yet somehow, through impossible calculation and pure courage, the plane descended toward the narrow patch of earth, wobbling violently but holding together. Then, just as hope surged, a shadow loomed from above. Lightning revealed a massive tree leaning into their path, hidden until the last moment. Emma's heart skipped. One miscalculation now, and everything would end. She tightened her grip, took a deep breath, and prepared for the impossible maneuver that could either save them or doom the flight entirely. Emma's heart hammered against her ribcage as the massive tree loomed directly in their descent path. The plane, already battered and groaning, teetered on the edge of catastrophe. Time seemed to stretch and twist. The world outside the cockpit blurred into a swirl of gray clouds, jagged tree lines and patches of earth barely big enough to land a car, let alone a 737. Emma's small hands tightened on the yoke, knuckles white, sweat stinging her eyes. Hold on, she whispered to herself, mind racing through every flight simulator drill she had memorized, every emergency scenario she'd practiced in private. The plane dipped violently, and a sharp alarm blared, the left wing scraping branches. Passengers screamed, some praying aloud, others frozen in wide-eyed terror. Claire gripped her daughter's hand through the seat, tears streaming, whispering, "You can do this, Emma, please." Captain Hayes leaned close, his face pale and drawn. "Emma, there's no room for error. You have to clear that tree and land in that clearing." His voice cracked, disbelief mingling with fear. Jonah's hands flew over the instruments, trying to monitor systems that had begun to fail completely. The right engine had quit entirely, and the left one was faltering fast. Every second counted. Every move could tip the scales between survival and disaster. Emma's eyes darted to the obstacle. The tree's massive trunk and sprawling branches threatened to tear the fuselage apart. She felt the plane shudder under the turbulence, almost as if it knew the stakes. Then, instinct and preparation collided. "Flaps up slightly, lift just a little, throttle, minim. Hold it steady," she called out, voice clear despite adrenaline. Hayes followed her directions, barely believing the precision with which she guided the failing aircraft. The fuselage groaned as the left wing scraped a branch, sparks flying inside the cabin. Oxygen masks dangled, bouncing violently as screams echoed through the plane. A man in row 17 clutched the armrests, white-knuckled, praying under his breath. A little girl in 9B hid her face in her mother's lap, sobbing quietly. Claire felt her grip on Emma's hand tighten, as if sheer will could transfer through the seats to her daughter. Emma shifted the yoke delicately, inching the nose upward, feeling the plane respond. Inches, mere inches. The tree branch snapped and scraped past, leaving jagged grooves in the fuselage. Hayes exhaled sharply, muttering, "She's doing it, she actually cleared it." Jonah didn't speak, too focused on calculating glide paths, fuel remaining, and altitude. They were moments from survival or complete catastrophe. Outside, the clearing rushed up, deceptively small, barely enough for the landing gear to touch down. Emma's mind worked in overdrive, plotting the descent, adjusting for turbulence, gusts, and the failing engine. Nose slightly up, flaps full, throttle low, steady, she murmured. The plane trembled violently, bouncing against invisible currents of air, every vibration threatening to throw them into chaos. In the cabin, passengers were pressed into their seats by inertia, some screaming, others gripping loved ones. Claire's eyes were locked on the cockpit glass, heart in her throat. "Come on, Emma, you can do this," she whispered, praying silently. The plane's shadow stretched across the clearing like a dark omen, and the trees lining the edge seemed to reach for them, ready to tear the aircraft apart. Emma's hands moved with unerring precision. She guided the plane's descent, flaring just before the patch of ground. The landing gear touched down with a violent jolt, scraping rocks and uneven soil. Sparks flew from the undercarriage as the plane skidded across the dirt, bouncing violently. Oxygen masks swung as passengers screamed in terror, some gripping the seatbacks, some crying in relief already, unable to process the miracle unfolding. The left engine coughed, sputtered, and died. Smoke poured from the exhaust, filling the cabin with the smell of burned metal. Emma's stomach lurched, but she held the yoke steady, fighting to keep the plane on course. Hayes and Jonah braced, yelling instructions as the aircraft veered dangerously toward a cluster of jagged rocks. The plane groaned, the fuselage bending, stress almost palpable, like a living thing resisting its impending doom. Emma adjusted once more, guiding the plane with surgical precision. The nose lifted slightly as the tail scraped across rocks, then she pushed forward gently, leveling the aircraft. With a violent screech of metal and rubber, the plane finally rolled past the tree line, sliding across uneven ground until friction slowed it to a shuddering stop. Silence fell, a stunned, fragile silence broken only by the hiss of the dying engine and the occasional groan of the battered fuselage. Passengers sat frozen, hearts pounding, wide-eyed. Some clutched seatbacks trembling. Some wept openly, too overwhelmed to process relief yet. Claire fell to her knees, tears streaming down her face, sobbing into the seat in front of her. "Emma, my baby, you did it," she whispered, voice shaking. Emma turned to her mother, small hands trembling but a faint smile on her bloodied, sweat-streaked face. Captain Hayes staggered toward the controls, hands shaking. I don't believe it," he muttered, awe and exhaustion battling in his voice. Jonah's eyes were wide behind sweat-streaked glasses, disbelief etched on his features. She actually did it," he breathed. "An 11-year-old, she saved 275 lives." Outside, the storm still raged, lightning slicing across the clouds, but the plane sat precariously, miraculously intact. Smoke drifted from the left engine, tires buried slightly in the uneven ground. Rescue vehicles, alerted after the plane's loss of contact, were beginning to appear on the horizon. The passengers, shaking, exhausted, and incredulous, began to realize the scale of what had just occurred. Emma finally unclenched her hands from the yoke, exhaustion washing over her in waves. Her vision blurred, knees weak, but relief and triumph surged beneath the fear. She had faced the impossible and lived, guiding a massive aircraft, and everyone aboard through the storm. The knowledge that she had done it alone at such a young age hit her with a mix of pride, disbelief, and lingering terror. And yet, as the passengers slowly unbuckled and began to step toward rescue crews, a new danger revealed itself. The storm that had nearly killed them was not finished. A wall of lightning-charged clouds began to descend on the clearing, threatening to engulf the plane and everyone aboard. Emma's relief was short-lived, and the fight for survival was far from over. The clearing was a fragile haven, but the storm that had nearly claimed Flight 739 wasn't finished. Dark clouds churned overhead and lightning sliced the sky with violent precision, illuminating the battered fuselage in stark flashes. Rain began to fall, at first in scattered drops, then in sheets that pelted the aircraft like shards of ice. The passengers huddled, shivering and soaked, some still too stunned to move, others clinging to one another in quiet terror. Claire wrapped her arms around Emma, holding her tight as the girl trembled, exhaustion finally catching up to her. You saved us all," Claire whispered, tears running down her cheeks, mingling with rain and sweat. Emma's voice was barely audible, trembling under the weight of adrenaline and fatigue. I just did what I had to." Her small frame shook, but her eyes were still sharp, alert despite the terror they had endured. Captain Hayes staggered to the passenger cabin doorway, surveying the scene. His uniform was soaked, his face pale, eyes wide in disbelief. "Everyone stay calm," he shouted, trying to inject order into the chaos. But the storm made it nearly impossible. Rain hammered the fuselage, wind tore at hair and clothing, and passengers struggled to keep their balance on the uneven terrain. The realization that they were still in danger, even after the miraculous landing, sank in like a cold weight. Outside, the first rescue teams arrived. Jeeps and fire trucks navigated the rough, muddy terrain, headlights cutting through the gray gloom. Helicopters circled overhead, beams slicing the storm clouds in an attempt to locate the passengers. Emergency personnel shouted directions over the roar of wind and rain, but the terrain was treacherous, and every movement risked slipping, falling, or worse. Emma, drenched and shaking, stood beside her mother. She watched the rescue crews struggle toward them, and for the first time allowed herself a moment to feel the magnitude of what she had done. Every person aboard the plane owed their life to her quick thinking, her knowledge, and her courage. Her small shoulders bore a weight far heavier than most adults would ever know. Jonah moved among the passengers, helping the elderly and children to safety, while Hayes remained near the cockpit, making sure the plane wouldn't slide further down the uneven clearing. "We're not out of danger yet," he muttered, more to himself than anyone else. Emma's eyes flicked to him. "I know I'll help," she said, voice stronger now, adrenaline lending her strength. She ran alongside him, gripping ropes and handholds, helping guide the frightened passengers toward safety. Lightning struck nearby, illuminating the clearing in blinding white. A tree toppled a few meters from the plane, cracking the ground beneath it. A scream went up from a young woman clinging to the side of the fuselage, and Hayes lunged, pulling her to safety just as the tree hit the muddy ground with a resounding crash. Emma's heart leapt to her throat. "We have to keep moving," she shouted to the others. Her voice carried authority far beyond her age, a command born of experience, fear, and necessity. Rain intensified, turning the clearing into a slippery quagmire. Passengers slipped and stumbled, but Emma moved like a beacon through the chaos, guiding them toward the edge where rescue vehicles could reach them. Some followed blindly, trusting her, others hesitated, frozen by fear. Claire held Emma close, whispering words of encouragement. "You're amazing, baby, so amazing," Emma swallowed, keeping her focus forward. There was no time to dwell on praise. Survival demanded movement, vigilance, and courage. Suddenly, a loud crack split the storm. A tree further down the clearing, weakened by the wind, began to fall toward the plane. Emma froze for a heartbeat, calculating angles in an instant. "Everyone move now," she shouted, sprinting forward, dragging the nearest passengers away from the danger zone. Hayes and Jonah joined, forming a human chain to pull people to safety. The tree slammed into the far wing of the plane with a violent crash, bending metal, shattering windows, and sending shards of debris flying. Passengers screamed, some collapsing to the muddy ground, others clutching one another, trembling in shock. Claire held Emma tightly, tears streaming, heart pounding. "You saved us again," she whispered, voice choked. Emma's chest heaved with exhaustion, but she nodded, eyes scanning the storm for the next threat. The clearing had become a battlefield, every second a struggle between chaos and survival. Rescue crews finally reached the group, shouting instructions through the roar of wind and rain. They handed out ropes, secured the injured, and began guiding passengers toward vehicles. Emma moved alongside them, helping anyone who stumbled, ensuring that no one was left behind. Her bravery inspired others, giving courage to those paralyzed by fear. Hayes watched in awe, disbelief still etched across his face. "I can't believe this, that an 11-year-old," he trailed off, unable to finish. As the last passengers were secured and helped into vehicles, Emma finally allowed herself a moment to collapse. Rain soaked her through, mud clinging to her clothes, and exhaustion hit like a wave. Hayes crouched beside her, placing a hand on her shoulder. "Kid, you just saved 275 lives today. I don't know what else to say." Jonah nodded, tears mixing with rain. "You're a hero. There's no other word for it." Even as relief and gratitude began to wash over the group, the storm was not yet finished. Lightning still flashed overhead, thunder rolling like a warning. The plane, though stationary, was precarious, and rescue crews warned that another landslide or gust could shift it dangerously. Emma looked at the battered fuselage, realizing that even after performing the impossible, the danger wasn't fully behind them. Claire hugged her daughter tightly, voice trembling. "You did it, Emma, but we're not out of the woods yet, not fully." Emma nodded, exhausted, yet alert. She had faced death in the sky and survived, guided hundreds of lives through chaos, but the storm, the elements, and the fragile safety of the clearing reminded her that every victory was temporary, every moment a battle against forces far beyond her control. And as the storm raged, a faint rumble echoed through the mountains, an ominous sound that promised that the challenges they had faced were only the beginning. By the time the storm had begun to recede, the clearing was a chaotic scene of mud, debris, and exhausted passengers. Rescue crews had secured the perimeter, dragging the last of the survivors into trucks and SUVs bound for the nearest emergency station. Emma stumbled, clutching her mother's hand, mud caking her shoes and clothes. Her body screamed with exhaustion, but her mind refused to rest. She had saved lives today, yes, but the enormity of what she had done was only beginning to sink in. Captain Hayes approached, soaking wet and shivering. His expression was a mixture of awe and disbelief. "Emma, you need to sit down," he said gently, though his voice trembled. "Do you have any idea what you just accomplished?" Emma shook her head, unable to process the gravity. She had acted instinctively, relying on knowledge, instinct, and sheer courage, but the scale of her heroism dwarfed anything she'd ever imagined. The passengers, still wrapped in blankets and emergency jackets, began to recognize the girl who had saved them. Whispers turned to murmurs, murmurs to cries of gratitude. "It's her! It was her!" a man said, tears streaking his dirt-streaked face. A flight attendant knelt beside Emma, holding her hands. "You're incredible, you saved all of us." The words barely registered through the haze of adrenaline and exhaustion, but they hit her heart like a physical blow. News crews had arrived, lights flashing, cameras rolling, capturing the scene as the storm lifted. From a distance, helicopters hovered, recording every second. Hayes stepped forward, speaking to reporters, his voice hoarse. An 11-year-old girl took control of a Boeing 737 during a catastrophic emergency and guided the plane to a clearing, saving 275 lives. Words fail me. She is nothing short of a hero. The cameras zoomed in on Emma, her small frame drenched, mud-streaked but standing tall, eyes wide with shock. Journalists approached, microphones thrust forward, questions rapid fire. "Emma, how did you do it? Were you scared?" A man's voice pierced the chaos while camera shutters clicked endlessly. Emma swallowed hard, clutching her mother's hand. I had to," she whispered, voice trembling. Every word felt inadequate, every answer failing to capture the terror, the split-second calculations, the sheer weight of responsibility she had carried. Claire held her daughter close, shielding her from the attention as best she could. "My baby, my brave, amazing baby," she murmured repeatedly, voice cracking. Emma's eyes met her mother, and for the first time the enormity of what she had done hit her fully. Not just surviving, but saving hundreds of lives. It was overwhelming. Her small hands trembled, heart racing from adrenaline that refused to leave her system. Captain Hayes crouched beside her, his uniform still sodden, dirt clinging to his shoes. "Emma, what you didn't know, one in my 20 years has done anything like it. You need to understand, people will never forget this. The entire country, the world, will hear your story." Jonah stood behind, nodding, his face pale. "You carried the impossible on your shoulders," he said softly, "and you succeeded." Despite the accolades, a gnawing tension lingered. Emma's eyes drifted toward the battered plane, smoke curling from the left engine, the fuselage dented and scarred. She had guided it down, yes, but the wreckage was a stark reminder of what could have gone wrong at any moment. She felt a chill run down her spine. Adrenaline no longer shielded her from reality. The storm had passed, but the danger wasn't fully behind them. Emergency crews began surveying the plane, preparing for extraction and towing. "We need to secure the aircraft before anything else happens," one officer shouted over the wind. Hayes nodded, but his gaze lingered on Emma. "Kid, you're incredible, but I need you to stay with the survivors. You've done enough." Emma nodded reluctantly, still processing the surreal aftermath. She couldn't yet grasp that she had performed something that would be etched in aviation history. News helicopters circled overhead, broadcasting live feeds, the country collectively holding its breath as images of the muddy clearing, and the tiny girl standing beside the plane went viral. Social media exploded, hashtags trending globally, millions sharing and reacting to footage of Emma and the miraculous landing. Yet amidst the attention, Emma remained focused on the immediate. The passengers still shaken, the storm clouds overhead, and the knowledge that every second mattered until everyone was fully safe. And then came a subtle, almost imperceptible sound, a low rumble from the mountains surrounding the clearing. Hayes froze, eyes narrowing, scanning the horizon. "That doesn't sound good," he muttered. Emma instinctively moved closer, the echoing growl of shifting earth setting her nerves on edge. Rescue crews exchanged worried glances, their movements brisk, urgency heightened. The storm may have passed, but nature still threatened the fragile safety of the clearing. Claire gripped Emma's arm, sensing the rising tension. "What now?" she asked, voice tight with fear. Emma's gaze swept over the muddy, debris-strewn landscape. She knew instinctively that this was not the end, that surviving the landing and the storm had been one battle, but they might be facing another. Her chest tightened. Fatigue and terror warred within her, yet she pushed down fear. She had saved lives once. If danger came again, she might have to do it all over again. The rumble grew louder. The trees bordering the clearing swayed violently as if warning of impending chaos. Rescue crews halted, scanning the slopes, shouting into radios. Hayes and Jonah exchanged grim looks. Emma's hands tightened on her mother's arm. "Something coming, and we might have to move fast," she whispered. Fear surged through her, but so did resolve. She had faced the impossible once. Maybe, just maybe, she could do it again. The world watched as Emma Collins, 11 years old, stood in the storm's aftermath. A hero whose courage had already defied imagination. But even as applause, cameras, and social media recognition erupted, the low, threatening rumble reminded everyone that survival was never guaranteed, and that the next challenge was coming faster than anyone expected. The ground beneath the clearing vibrated with a low, ominous rumble that grew steadily louder. Rescue crews paused, shouts caught in their throats, eyes scanning the surrounding mountains. Trees swayed violently, branches snapping as if warning them to retreat. Emma felt her stomach twist. She had guided the plane to safety, saved hundreds of lives, and faced down a storm, but now nature itself seemed poised to challenge them again. "Everyone stay calm," Captain Hayes shouted, though his voice was tight with tension. "We might have a mudslide or some kind of landslide coming. Move back toward higher ground." Passengers, still dazed and exhausted, hesitated. Many had never been this close to death before. Some trembled violently, while others clung to loved ones, unsure if they could survive another brush with catastrophe. Emma gripped her mother's hand, eyes scanning the tree line, calculating the safest route. "We need to move quickly but steadily." "Follow me," she said, voice firm despite exhaustion. Her small frame led the way, guiding passengers across the muddy, debris-strewn clearing toward a slight incline at the edge of the forest. Every second counted. The rumble beneath them grew louder, like the growl of a beast waking from slumber. Claire followed, clutching Emma tightly. "You're incredible, baby. I don't know how you keep going," she whispered, voice trembling. Emma didn't reply. She couldn't allow herself to be distracted. Behind them, the plane groaned in the wind, its fuselage scarred from scraping treetops, bent metal threatening to collapse at any moment. They had survived one disaster. Another might be just seconds away. The first wave hit. Rocks and mud tumbled down the mountain slope, slamming into trees, scattering debris across the clearing. Passengers screamed, some falling to the ground, some caught in the surge. Emma lunged, pulling a young boy from the path of a rolling boulder, her small hand surprisingly strong with determination. Hayes and Jonah assisted, forming a chain to guide people safely uphill. Every movement was a fight against nature itself. Lightning flashed overhead, illuminating the chaos. Rain continued to pour, turning the earth into a slick, treacherous battlefield. Rescue crews shouted into radios, calling for reinforcement, but the mountain's roar nearly drowned all voices. Emma's lungs burned, muscles screamed, but she refused to stop. Every life depended on her focus, her instincts, and the courage she had summoned from some hidden well within herself. A massive boulder hurtled down the slope, narrowly missing Claire and Emma. Hayes pushed them out of the path, sliding on mud and dirt, landing hard but intact. Jonah helped the last passengers onto safer footing, shouting encouragement. "Come on, almost there." He had never seen such resolve in anyone, let alone an 11-year-old, whose determination outshone even the most seasoned adults. The passengers, exhausted, battered, and terrified, finally reached the slight incline that would serve as temporary safe ground. Emma stood at the edge, surveying the destruction, the plane below, the storm retreating, and the ongoing landslide threatening to wipe away everything. Her chest heaved, her hands shaking, but her mind was already calculating next steps. Survival was not complete until every single life was truly out of danger. Claire wrapped her arms around Emma, whispering, "We're alive, we're actually alive." Emma's eyes were fixed on the clearing, on the battered aircraft, and the dangerous slope beyond. "Not everyone is safe yet," she murmured. Her voice was steady, but inside, exhaustion gnawed at her bones. She had saved lives in the sky, now she had to ensure they survived the earth. The rumble intensified. A tree at the top of the slope cracked and fell, narrowly missing several passengers. Hayes shouted orders, guiding people higher. Emma ran back down to assist a woman stuck in mud, dragging her to safety. Jonah followed, helping stabilize those who had slipped. The clearing was a war zone, a mixture of mud, shattered trees, debris, and rain-slicked earth, yet Emma's courage and calm inspired everyone to keep moving. Then came the final, terrifying wave, a combination of mud, rocks, and uprooted trees cascading toward the plane. Hayes realized if the plane shifted or collapsed, it could trigger further disaster. "Emma, the plane!" he shouted. She turned, eyes widening. The fuselage tilted dangerously under the weight of falling debris, groaning and creaking. Without hesitation, Emma calculated angles, timing, and trajectories. She called out, "We need to move in 3, 2, now," and guided the passengers away just as the wave slammed into the aircraft, scattering debris everywhere. Everyone reached temporary safety, breathing hard, hearts pounding. Emma sank to her knees, mud streaking her clothes, rain dripping from her hair, muscles trembling with exhaustion. Hayes crouched beside her, voice low and reverent. You did it again, you saved them from this too." Jonah nodded, eyes wide, still reeling from the near-impossible sequence. I don't know how you do it," he said, voice shaking. Claire held her daughter, rocking her slightly, whispering, "You're amazing, Emma, my hero." Emma's small hands rested on her knees, eyes scanning the ruined clearing, the battered plane, and the survivors who now stood behind her. Relief mingled with lingering terror. They had survived the sky, the storm, and the earth's fury, but the adrenaline wouldn't leave her system yet. Her body ached, and the magnitude of everything she had endured threatened to overwhelm her. Above, the clouds began to part, sunlight cutting through the gray veil, illuminating the destruction and survival alike. Emma looked around at the passengers, shivering, soaked, terrified but alive, and allowed herself the smallest, trembling smile. They were safe for now, but deep in her mind she knew this day would never be forgotten, and the memory of the impossible decisions she had made would stay with her forever. And even as rescue helicopters descended, lights cutting through the clearing, Emma sensed that the world she had entered, the one in which her courage had been tested beyond imagination, was only just beginning. The sun broke through the clouds, casting golden streaks over the battered clearing. Helicopters circled overhead, rescue crews secured the perimeter, and emergency vehicles rumbled through the mud, headlights cutting through the storm's aftermath. The survivors, soaked, exhausted, and trembling, were finally safe. Yet in the middle of the chaos stood one small girl, 11 years old, mud-streaked and shivering, whose courage had rewritten what the world thought possible. Emma's legs trembled as she stood beside her mother, looking out at the wrecked Boeing 737. The fuselage was scarred, windows shattered, wings bent like crumpled paper, but it hadn't claimed a single life. She had flown it, guided it, and saved everyone aboard. The magnitude of what she had accomplished pressed down on her chest. Her small hands trembled, but her eyes shone with awe, disbelief, and an unshakable pride. Captain Hayes approached slowly, his soaked uniform clinging to his frame, face pale, eyes glimmering with unshed tears. "Emma, I've flown thousands of flights, faced emergencies no one can imagine, but I've never seen anything like what you just did. You saved 275 lives today. You're extraordinary." Jonah nodded beside him, voice hoarse from shouting over storm and chaos. "We were trained our entire lives for situations like this. You just did what we couldn't." Emma's mother wrapped her arms around her, holding her tight as tears streamed down her face. "My baby, my brave, brave girl, I can't believe what you did," Claire whispered, voice cracking. Emma buried her face against her mother's shoulder, exhausted beyond measure. She had faced death in the sky, the fury of a storm, and the rage of a mountain, and she had survived. And she had saved 275 people. The weight of it all crashed down on her small shoulders. News crews and reporters began to arrive in force, cameras flashing, microphones thrust toward her, capturing the moment for the world to see. The hashtags were already trending, millions watching live. "Emma, how did you do it?" shouted a reporter. "Were you scared?" another asked. Emma swallowed hard, still shaky. I just had to help," she whispered, voice trembling. "I didn't think about fear, I just tried to keep everyone safe." Passengers approached her one by one, hugging her, shaking her hand, weeping openly. "You saved my daughter," a mother said, tears streaming. "You saved me," an elderly man whispered, gripping her small hands. Emma could hardly respond, overwhelmed by the outpouring of gratitude and emotion. Her eyes flicked to her mother, who simply held her, whispering, "You're amazing, the whole world will see it soon." Captain Hayes crouched beside her, glancing at the wrecked plane and then back at her. "I don't know how to thank you. You have more courage than anyone I've ever met. You changed lives today, not just saved them, changed them." Jonah nodded, still trembling. "History will remember this. You're going to be famous, Emma, a hero for the ages." The words rang out, heavy with awe, truth, and admiration. The survivors were slowly transported to safety, blankets wrapped around shoulders, faces pale from shock but alive. Emma walked beside them, helping where she could, her small hands still trembling from fatigue. She realized then that heroism was not just about the act. It was about responsibility, courage, and the willingness to act when everyone else froze. She had done that, and nothing could take it away. Hours later, as emergency crews finally stabilized the wreckage and the storm clouds receded completely, Emma and Claire sat on the hillside, watching helicopters rise into the golden sky. Emma leaned against her mother, eyes distant, reflecting on everything that had happened. The terror, the adrenaline, the decisions that had been impossible, yet necessary. She had faced the unthinkable and survived, guiding others to do the same. A gust of wind swept across the clearing, carrying away debris and rain, leaving only the remnants of the ordeal. Captain Hayes approached again, kneeling to speak to her at eye level. "Emma, you're the bravest person I've ever met. Not just a hero in the air, but in life. Don't ever forget that." Emma nodded, feeling the weight of the words sink deep. She had been ordinary one morning and extraordinary the next. As the first official helicopter lifted off, carrying the last of the survivors, Emma stood and watched, knowing her life had changed forever. Social media, news outlets, and the entire nation would tell her story. She would be lauded, celebrated, remembered. Yet in that quiet moment, standing beside her mother in the sunlit aftermath, she felt something deeper: humility, awe, and an unshakable bond with the lives she had saved. The world would call her a hero, a miracle, even a prodigy. But Emma knew the truth. It had been courage, focus, and the will to act when everyone else panicked that had saved them. She had faced death in every imaginable form, and she had triumphed. And though the scars of that day would linger in memory and body, so too would the knowledge that one small girl had done the impossible. And as the wind swept across the clearing, stirring the mud and the wreckage, Emma looked toward the horizon, heart steady, whispering softly to herself, "I did it. We did it." The plane had been stopped. The storm had passed. The passengers were safe. And an 11-year-old girl had changed the course of hundreds of lives forever.